Today on Inside Utah Politics, Congressman John Curtis, he wants to move from the House to the Senate. What he's sharing with us about that potential move. And State of the Union. President Biden makes his final State of the Union address before Election Day. And for him, the stakes are very high. The big moments and reaction to them.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
And thank you for joining us. I'm Brian McElhatton. Let's go inside Utah politics, shall we? The race for Utah Senate seat is heating up, and we're talking to the candidates now looking to replace Senator Mitt Romney when his term is done. This week, I sat down to talk with Congressman John Curtis, the frontrunner in that race. So let's listen to what he had to share with us. Well, Congressman John Curtis, welcome to Inside Utah Politics. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Brian. It's a delight to be on your show.
Well, I want to ask you, the State of the Union this week, you were there watching that in person. What did you make of President Biden's speech?
Well, I'll tell you, just first of all, it was probably the most partisan speech that all of us have heard. That was the comments of my colleagues, is we felt like it was just 100% partisan. And that part was a little disappointing for me. Senator
Romney commented, he said he liked Biden's approach to foreign policy, what he had to say. It was Biden's domestic policy that Mr. Romney took issue with, specifically the debt. Not a lot of talk about the debt in that speech. How do you feel about that?
Well, I would agree. I mean, President Biden listed, he just kept going with programs that he wanted to do or finance or money he wanted to give back. And, all of us are saying in our head, well, who wouldn't like those things, but how are we going to pay for them? And the list was long. And I would totally agree with Senator Romney that it's fiscally, it was just left us all scratching our heads.
As I've watched the State of the Union over the years, I've seen outfits become more colorful. I've seen badges and buttons on people on both sides of the aisle. Now, we hear a lot about acrimony in Washington, about little scuffles back and forth, verbal scuffles. Is it as acrimonious as it seems to those of us who are not in Washington, or are you guys friends behind the scenes? How does that work?
Well, it was really interesting. I had a couple of guests with me, and I had an opportunity before the State of the Union to intermingle with my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, and they were surprised how congenial everybody was. There were actually more than one opportunities where I was discussing with a Democratic colleague legislation that we wanted to work on together, and I kind of wish I could have brought all of my constituents to that with me to see that experience and realize that we actually like each other and we get along a lot better than most people see in what's shown in the press.
Well, you are running for Senate. You are hoping to fill the seat that Mitt Romney is vacating when he is done with his term. And I want to talk to you about some of the big issues right now. We're hearing a lot about immigration. You were recently down at the border, and we hear about border security. We hear about immigration reform in Washington. Where does the conversation need to start for you?
Well, in a perfect world, we'd just be able to go top to bottom and totally reform not only what we're doing at the border, but the whole immigration system. It's obvious that it's just outdated and has lots of flaws. But the conversation is all centered around the border right now. It's hard to move beyond the border because we just see, I think both right and left see there are just too many people coming across. And perhaps more importantly, that the cartels are controlling who's coming across. And that's a really bad place for us to be as a country. So all conversations right now are focused on the border and how do we fix that problem there.
Do you support the completion of Donald Trump's border wall?
So a couple of months ago, almost 10 months ago, we passed what's called H.R. 2 in the House. And the reality of it is this is a far more complicated thing than simply a wall. There's policy, for instance, remain in Mexico and taking a look at our asylum program. It's not as easy as one thing. That's why H.R. 2 is so important, is it combines really many, many policies and financing, more Border Patrol agents, more judges, more resources, a lot of things that we really need to do to do the border in a way that I think Utahns would have us handle it.
You've got a lot of folks coming from Latin America who are fleeing poverty, they're fleeing violence, corrupt governments. One critique against U.S. foreign policy in that area of the world is that it has been weak. It has not been a focus of really any administration lately. And I wonder, you feel we should strengthen our foreign policy in that region of the world to help people feel more comfortable there to improve conditions, to maybe lessen the demand for immigration into this country?
And another way to look at that, too, is certainly that's important. But we also need to realize that there are many appropriate ways to come into this country, although difficult, and we need to improve that. But everywhere I go in Utah, employers are telling me they cannot find the workforce they need. And we've got to figure out a way to connect those needs with those who would come into our country, obeying the laws, paying taxes, respecting our culture. And there's a real need and an important way to fulfill that. But until we stop that illegal flow, it's hard to have those discussions.
I want to ask you about something that really made headlines this week, and that was a bill that advanced regarding TikTok and having TikTok divest from its parent company, its Chinese parent company, ByteDance. You fully support that measure?
You know, that was a super interesting experience in Washington, D.C. yesterday. In the morning, some of my colleagues did not support that bill. By the end of the day, it was a 50-0 vote. And TikTok was on their worst behavior yesterday. And I just want to double down on something you said. This is not banning TikTok. This is simply divesting it, moving its ownership from China into the United States. That's all that we're asking. And it really played out yesterday to show how important this is, because TikTok literally locked their users out until they called their member of Congress and told them not to do this. And it shows you that's one thing to do if you're here in the United States. But for a foreign entity to do that, it shows you how much influence they could actually have, for instance, over our elections. That's why that bill got a 50-0 vote. All my Democratic colleagues, all our Republicans said, look, what China can do with this app, we don't want them to be able to control us or our elections. We don't have any problem. Well, I won't say that we don't have any problem with TikTok, but that's not what this is about. This is simply saying that foreign ownership by China is hugely problematic.
Now, if TikTok does not divest, right, from its parent company, if the company doesn't find an American, a domestic buyer for this company, then we would potentially see a TikTok ban in this country. Am I reading that language right?
Yes, you are correct. But remember, that fully puts this into the hands of TikTok. This is their decision. If they want to continue to operate, we're not saying you can't operate. We're just saying that you can only operate under these circumstances. And let me kind of go a little bit deeper on why that's so important. We know that in China, the Chinese government can mandate, and they do mandate, that data owned by a Chinese company is accessible to the Chinese government. I know that we have a lot of conversations about data privacy and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, but I don't think in any circumstance the Chinese government having access to our users' data is appropriate. And that's why this is so problematic.
Because TikTok is such a powerful platform, so many young people use it in this country to keep in touch with each other, to learn about things, to expose themselves to different ideas. Are you worried about alienating potentially young voters by going after TikTok so aggressively?
You know, it was a really interesting experience with what TikTok did, forcing their users to call my office. My office literally had interface with hundreds of TikTok users, perhaps thousands yesterday. And there were very few, if any, exceptions once we explained what the bill actually did that caused any concern. I think TikTok was a little disingenuous because they promoted that we were trying to ban them, which is not correct. And as we explained that to the phone calls, people really understood and didn't really have a problem with it. So that's on us to communicate better with people what we're actually trying to do. And I think if we do that, people will realize this is important for the security of our country.
You're a member of the Conservative Climate Caucus. You talk about conservation. You talk about climate change. That's a fraught conversation oftentimes to have with people. There's such a debate over the mechanics of climate change right now. Where do you stand on clean energy and the transition going forward into clean energy, specifically here in Utah?
This is a really important question for Utah, and I'm sure glad you brought it up. The reality of it is that what we have in Utah is incredibly important to our energy future, and that's both our fossil fuels and perhaps more importantly, our innovation. What I see every day happening in Utah on innovation on fuels is just amazing, and we're working on geothermal. There's a lot of geothermal in Utah. All of these are important, and I envision a future, let's just say 2050, where we're totally dependent on three things with our energy. That's affordability, reliability, and cleanliness. And if people look close, they'll see that all of these sources in Utah are moving towards, they're either doing very well or moving towards all three of those categories. And that's important for Utah to stay relevant and for those who represent Utah to make sure that we're talking about the reality that what we have in Utah is not the problem, it's actually part of the solution. And how we move forward on that is incredibly important.
Well, tell me about this GEO bill that you are supporting, doubling down on geothermal energy here. How would that work?
Yeah, so the GEO bill is my bill. I'm very proud of it, and it would help expedite the permitting of geothermal. And if people look closely, they'll see this has actually been part of Utah for a long time, and that we have a huge potential in our state for geothermal. And geothermal, if I go back to those three categories, affordable, reliable, clean, hits it out of the ballpark on all three. And so I'm really excited for the future of geothermal, particularly in Utah, and want to make sure that we move it forward as quickly as we can.
Are you bullish on nuclear energy?
Look, it's hard to find somebody in Washington, D.C. that's not. And the reality of our energy future clearly includes nuclear. And if people will look closely, they'll see we're not talking about the nuclear of our grandparents' nuclear. We're talking about a nuclear where you don't have safety issues, where you don't have issues with spent fuel rods. But it's here again, coming back to affordable, reliable, clean, it's a very important part of our energy future, and I think a very important part in Utah as well.
Congressman John Curtis, we appreciate your time here on the show, and we hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Brian.
Take care. And coming up, we're taking a look at the president's State of the Union address this week, including his calls on Congress to put aside the partisan fighting and get to work for the American people. Got a full breakdown next. This week, President Joe Biden delivered his annual State of the Union address, highlighting his accomplishments and at times firing back at Republicans he blamed for putting politics over country. Washington correspondent Trevor Shirley was inside the chamber for the speech and has a look at what happened.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
President Joe Biden wasted no time facing head-on some of his biggest electoral liabilities.
I know it may not look like it, but I've been around a while.
At times, the president using humor to cut through concerns about his age.
My lifetime has taught me to embrace freedom and democracy.
A democracy the president also accused Republicans of putting at risk.
I ask all of you, without regard to party, to join together and defend democracy.
The president also challenging critics of his economic policy, where he scores poorly among a majority of voters.
My inherited economy is on the brink. Now our economy is literally the envy of the world.
GOP critics say the president glossed over what most Americans are feeling.
They're feeling energy prices and food prices in the checkbook. And that was really not talked about.
The most contentious moments of the night happening as the president discussed immigration, accusing Republicans of killing a recent bipartisan border deal.
But unfortunately, politics has derailed this bill so far.
Republicans pushing back in their official post-speech rebuttal.
President Biden's border policies are a disgrace. This crisis is despicable. And the truth is, it is almost entirely preventable.
The president also called for protecting reproductive and voting rights and implored Congress to pass more Ukraine aid.
I say this to Congress, we have to stand up to Putin. Send me a bipartisan national security bill.
That was our Trevor Shirley reporting there. The question now, will the president's speech reset the campaign conversation as he hopes it does? Still ahead on Inside Utah Politics, we'll introduce you to Caroline Gleich, a Democrat running for Senate. Her name is easily recognized in the outdoor world, but will that translate to political success? Welcome back to Inside Utah Politics. We're joined by Caroline Gleich, a Democrat running for the U.S. Senate seat to represent Utah and replace Senator Mitt Romney, who last year, as you know, announced that he won't seek re-election, and he extended a call to a new generation of people who want to take up the mantle of representing Utah. Welcome to Inside Utah Politics.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for doing this series, because the press has such an important role in helping the public understand the positions of candidates, and then when they eventually get elected, holding our elected officials accountable. So thank you so much for your leadership and for your time and energy putting this together.
Hey, we're glad you're here. Thanks for being here. Okay, so if you open up Ski Magazine or you open up Adventure Journal or you're on the socials or you're up on the mountains, people are going to know you. But there are people who aren't quite familiar with you yet. Here you are, a millennial running for Senate. Does it feel like a heavy weight?
Yes, yes, I feel a lot of weight to represent the interests, the voices, and to serve Utah. I really feel called to service by the call of Senator Romney, asking for the next generation of leaders to step up. And yeah, for as long as I can remember, I've had the dream of climbing and skiing the biggest mountains in the world and using that platform to advocate for positive changes for people on the planet. And when I tell people about these dreams, they'd look at me, roll their eyes, they'd laugh, they'd say, "You're too small, you're not strong enough, you don't have the look of a mountaineer, a politician, or a leader in your eyes." And when we talk about these big, impossible goals, whether it's climbing Mount Everest or skiing Cho-Yu, the 6th highest peak in the world, people will tell us, or when it comes to those goals, or running as a Democrat for U.S. Senate in Utah, people will tell us that the goals are impossible. But I've done these things people say are impossible. I've always been the underdog. I am here to break stereotypes and to show people that this is possible.
Okay, so you have been skiing and summiting since you were 15 years old.
Yes.
Park City is home for you. So walk me back to that point when you thought, Senate, I'm going to do this. What informed your thinking there?
Yes, I've always loved a big goal, a big challenge, and when people said that running for U.S. Senate would be like climbing a mountain, I said, well, that's great, that's what I do. So I love a big, hairy project. I'm a woman of action, and I love figuring out all the little details and just all the different skills that come together. I was really motivated and inspired. And sometimes a mountain calls you. You know, sometimes you see a picture of a line on a mountain and you're like, oh, I have to ski that. And so when this opportunity opened up, I said yes, because I felt it was really important for Utah and for America.
So let's talk about some of the issues right now. You've been very outspoken on climate change. It's politically fraught in many circles to bring that up. Where do you think America's going right on climate change, and where do you think we're going wrong?
I think overall there's been a strong movement. I've been working as a community organizer and advocate for the environment, for reducing pollution, advocating for clean air for over a decade and a half. So I've been going to DC since 2014 to talk to our leaders. And it's been a huge change in the appetite for our elected officials at the federal level to talk about climate action solutions. There's a lot of talk, but there's not a lot of progress. And so I'm here to really advocate for accelerating our transition to a clean, renewable energy while supporting our legacy energy producing communities and make sure that they are supported through the transition.
This is the tricky spot, right? Because you have such an economic factor in fossil fuels, in the burning of coal and natural gas, a lot of good paying jobs in that realm. And a lot of people are worried what happens next.
Well, the clean energy revolution creates tons of new jobs. And there is a way that we can do this. And one of the things that people don't realize is the overwhelming subsidies for fossil fuels. I read in 2019, for example, the subsidies, federal subsidies for fossil fuels outweighed those for renewables 22-1. So while it seems like these are big economic things, it's actually that the burning of fossil fuels, the costs have been externalized to the public, and we've been paying the price with the public health burdens of dirty air, the increased rates of asthma. The University of Utah study that showed a 16% increased rate of miscarriage during poor air quality cycles, and that poor air comes largely from burning fossil fuels. So when you level the playing field, it really makes sense to go to clean, renewable energy.
There's a tension in Utah between the local folks here and the federal government over use and control of lands and natural resources. In the Senate, if you were to be elected, you'd be in a unique position to weigh in on that and talk to both sides here, right? So have you thought about this issue and sort of that tension that we're dealing with right now?
Yes, yes. Yeah. I worked for Ted Wilson, for Governor Gary Herbert's environmental advisor during that administration, and so I have an inside understanding of this tension between doing things the Utah way. However, I really believe, after traveling throughout the world to climb and ski, that there's a special thing we have with our American style of governance. Our federal government, our way of democracy, the way that our elected officials work to represent the interests of the people, and those institutions are worth protecting. It's worth it to engage and work with the federal government to find solutions. And so I think as Utah's next senator, I could do a much better job bridging the gap between the Utah way and working with the federal government to implement solutions that will benefit the lives of Utahns.
No doubt you would have to work with people who you disagree with, and sometimes to a great extent. Are you comfortable with the idea of making compromises that maybe you wouldn't really want to do if you had your way?
Yes, I am no stranger to working in these really male-dominated, stressful, high-risk environments. As a mountaineer, I mean, that is what I've done for the last decade and a half. And growing up with 3 brothers, I'm used to having arguments, I'm used to having discussions and finding ways to move forward with people that I don't necessarily agree with. And so I look forward to the challenge of bringing diverse stakeholders together and advocating for the needs of all Utahns.
I want to ask you about a really big issue in the polls right now and with voters on both sides of the aisle, immigration.
Yes.
We're hearing so much about it. No matter who you talk to, you'll know people are coming across the border. There's solutions that are debated about security and about policy changes in Washington. Where do you stand on border security? What do you think needs to be done to lock that down? Do you think it needs to be locked down?
Yes, absolutely. There's a huge need right now to secure the border, and I do support creating a physical barrier where it makes sense. But putting a physical barrier through places like these deep canyon gorges, there's some places where it doesn't make sense. At the same time, we need to provide people that are vetted and that are not criminals, good people. We need to provide them a pathway to legal citizenship. And so I think we need to do a lot more to speed up the rate that immigrant requests and visas can be issued and dialed, because at the end of the day, unless you're an indigenous Native American, everybody came here through immigration. So we need to provide a pathway for people. It can really help with a lot of our labor issues, labor shortages. And at the end of the day, I believe that we are an inclusive country. We are a country where we welcome people in. So we need to find a way to bring them in. At the same time, we also need to be looking at the issues that are causing people to flee their countries, and how can we support them to make their countries better to live in.
You think there's a need for a more robust foreign policy in Latin America?
Yeah, absolutely. What is the root cause of people wanting to flee their countries? And how can we provide people a pathway to get into this country and eventually become citizens?
Women's health care.
Yes.
Abortion. You've talked about this before.
Yeah.
Where do you stand on the abortion debate right now?
When it comes to women's reproductive freedom, we need to get the government to work on the places that they should be governing. There is a huge crisis with housing, with infrastructure, with energy, with all these other things, and get the government out of our personal, private decisions. Those are decisions that should be made between a patient and their doctor, not by the government.
There are a lot of people in Utah who say abortion, not okay at any time for any reason. Where do you fall on that?
Abortion is a terrible thing and nobody wants to have one. But again, it is not the scale and the scope of the government to be doing that. And at the end of the day, access to that kind of care is essential for women's health. And without that, right now what we're seeing is a huge amount of doctors that are leaving that field because they are so afraid of these regulations. There are some cases where it will save a woman's life. And so I don't want to see women die. I also want to see that women have access to care. And right now in Utah, if you're trying to make an appointment with a gynecologist, there is a 9 to 12-month wait. We're going to see that more women are going to die, and they're not going to be able to receive regular preventative care because of these decisions.
So as a Democrat, 1 minute left to the interview here, but as a Democrat, you will face a challenge here, right? You've talked about this a little bit earlier in the interview, but Democrats have traditionally had a really hard time in rural areas, talking with those folks out there. How do you think you can bridge that gap and reach out to them? Because you'll need them in your campaign.
Yes, I'm a woman and a person of principle, not party. When it came time to deciding with this two-party system, nobody likes the two-party system. There's a lot of things that Democrats do that I don't agree with, and there's been times that there's things that Republicans do that I'm like, yes, that's great. I will always put the interests of Utahns above any party interest. I'm not afraid to go against party lines and use my conscience to guide me.
Okay, Caroline Gleich, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Very good conversation, absolutely. We will continue to follow the important race and sit down with other Utah candidates running for U.S. Senate. You can vote for your choice during the primary elections, and we will be right back with more. And thanks for joining us here on Inside Utah Politics. You can watch us here every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock. Goodbye.